Now, an obvious question for you, given what I've just read. What were the marching orders Christ gave to his church? What was his last command that he gave to his disciples? I won't patronise you with saying, please shout it out, because we've just heard it. The last command he gave was go. In fact, very technically, actually go was the last command. Because if you want to know the technical word, go is the only imperative in what we've just read. Imperative means commanding word. Literally, Jesus told them, go, baptizing, making, and teaching. But go was the command. So how are we to go? What is going? What does it mean to go? I want us to see 3 ways in the New Testament that they obeyed this go. There might be more, and if you can think of others, please do tell them to me afterwards. But I've thought of 3, and I think it's well worth us seeing these 3. 3 ways of going. Here's the first, like the Apostle Paul. I'd like us to see a very strange claim the Apostle Paul made. Would you turn with me to Romans 15? Romans 15. To see something strange Paul said. Romans 15, let's start at verse 17. Verse 17. Therefore I glory in Christ Jesus in my service to God. I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me in leading the Gentiles to obey God by what I have said and done, by the power of signs and miracles, through the power of the Spirit. So, from Jerusalem all the way round to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. Rather, as it is written, those who were not told about him will see, and those who have not heard will understand. That is why I've often been hindered from coming to you. But now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I've been longing for many years to see you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. And we'll stop at that point, and please look especially at verse 19. Paul says, from Jerusalem all the way round to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. Now, I wonder, has anyone been to Illyricum and knows about Illyricum? Illyricum was a Roman province that stretched from what we now call Albania up to what we now call Slovenia. So you might have been there. It was the last Roman province before you get to Italy. And Paul says, I started at Jerusalem, and I have covered everywhere there is to cover until you get to Italy. He says, I have fully proclaimed Christ across the whole Eastern Mediterranean. That's an amazing claim. He says in verse 23, there's no more work for me to do. I've done all the work there is in this area. I'm going to move on to Italy and then into Spain. Now, that area, all the Eastern Mediterranean that Paul claims he's covered, historians estimate what percentage of the population had been exposed to the gospel by that time. I wonder if you've got a guess. What percentage of the population had been exposed to the gospel? I wonder what your guesses are. Anyone want to stick their neck out and have a guess? 10% I'm hearing? 20% I'm hearing? It's a bit like an auction, this, isn't it? Anyone going higher or going lower? The answer is they estimate less than 2%. Less than 2%. I know it's an estimate, but I expect it's quite an educated estimate. Less than 2% had been exposed to the gospel. How can Paul make such a claim? How can he say, there's no more work left for me to do in this area? I fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. I need to move on elsewhere. The answer is because he understood the type of going that Jesus had called him to do. The type of going he was called to was to go into new areas, to new people groups, and to plant a church, get it established, move on. Go to another new people group, get a church started, move on to another people group, and get a church started. That was his calling, to go plant churches in new people groups. It was both his call and it had Old Testament roots. That's why he quotes the Old Testament quite a lot in this chapter. If you look, for example, at verse 12, so we're in Romans 15, verse 12, Isaiah says, "The root of Jesse will spring up, one who will arise to rule over the nations. The Gentiles will hope in him." He understood. The Old Testament said there is a Messiah coming, a king. He's going to rule over the nations. And the word nations here is the word for ethnic groups. It's not United Kingdom and USA and France. It's every ethnic group, every people group. And so Paul went to ethnic groups who hadn't yet heard of Jesus. Verse 21. Verse 21, those who were not told about him will see, and those who have not heard will understand. It's a quote from Isaiah 52, and Paul says, the work I'm doing is fulfilling the Old Testament, so that every ethnic group gets to hear Jesus is king, gets a church proclaiming Jesus is king. All the ethnic groups must be one for him. And that's what was driving the Apostle Paul. He understood it from the Old Testament. He had it as a personal call from Christ. And we still today need people to go in a Paul-like way. It's still needed to go in a Paul-like way with Paul's attitude. Jesus the King must be acknowledged in every ethnic group. Now, I say we still need it today. Is actually, there are some difficulties here. What is an ethnic group? That's the sort of thing people write PhDs on. It's quite hard to work out. So are there still ethnic groups that are still unreached and don't know of Jesus? Yes, definitely. How many? That's very difficult to tell. One bit of research into this, called the Joshua Project, has estimated there are still 7,200 ethnic groups where Jesus is not known. I don't know if they've got that right, but even if they've wildly overestimated and it's half that, there are still many people groups where Jesus is not known. There is no effective church. There is one type of going we still need. People like Paul to go and reach the unreached. Here's a second type we still need. People like Timothy or Titus. Let's focus on Timothy. Timothy was from either Lystra or Derbe. It's not clear which, but he was from that area where those two cities were. But he was sent to go to Ephesus. It wasn't his hometown. But he wasn't sent to go to reach unreached people. He wasn't sent to go to start a new church, but to establish and get well-grounded a church already existing. I'll read to you from 1 Timothy. You might like to turn to it or just listen. 1 Timothy chapter 1. Verse 3, he's been sent to go to Ephesus, and then Paul says to him, as I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain men not to teach false doctrines any longer. It's different from Paul's work. He's got to go and fight false teaching. Chapter 3, verse 14. Chapter 3, verse 14. Although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing you these instructions so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. Paul says, Timothy, you've gone to Ephesus so you can teach the church, so people know how they ought to act, so the church can be the pillar displaying the truth and the foundation defending the truth. Later in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, he says, now I've got another thing for you to do. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others. I want you to pass the message on. So there's an established witness. Now, this doesn't mean Timothy just sits in church the whole time and never gets out there and speaks to unbelievers. Because in chapter 4, verse 5, he's told, and I want you to do the work of an evangelist. You see, so here is another way of going. Different from Paul's, but very needed to establish and grow churches that had already been started. To teach Christians who had already been reached, so that the church is the pillar and the foundation of the truth. And we still very much need people to go in a Timothy and Titus-like way today. I'll give you one example. Zambia might be one of the countries in the world that's had the most missionaries per head. There have been many missionaries go to Zambia, and it has a fairly small population. So my just guess is it's had a lot of missionaries per head of the population, more than many other countries. And Zambia is full of churches. You could not call it an unreached country by any stretch of the imagination. It's the sort of place people might say it doesn't need any missionaries. But I've been to Zambia many times, and as I would travel round the villages, I'd visit churches, and I'd talk to Christian leaders in the churches, and I would talk to teachers who taught in Christian schools. And I took to frequently asking them this question: how does a person become a Christian? And I nearly always got this answer: by repenting. What do you think? Good answer? Yeah, good answer. But what's the next question you have to ask? What is repenting? And the answer I nearly always got is this: repenting is doing good things so your good works outweigh your bad works. Good answer? Disastrous answer. If people think that's how you become a Christian, that is disaster. That is the route to hell. In case anyone here is not clear, you don't become a Christian by doing good things to outweigh your bad things. You turn to Jesus. You turn from trusting yourself and your goodness and your actions to trusting Jesus and what he has done for you. So there's still massive need in that very reached country. Not to mention that the churches are full of health and wealth teaching. We still need people to go in a Timothy and Titus-like way, with a Timothy and Titus-like attitude. We want Jesus to be honoured by churches that are the pillar and foundation of the truth. One more. We also need people to go like disciples. Now, Paul, Timothy and Titus were people especially called by Christ and appointed by the church to those roles. Christians shouldn't just self-identify as missionaries. They should be called by Christ and appointed and recognised by his church. So what about those not called to do that? Would you come with me to Acts chapter 8? Acts chapter 8. Acts 8, I'm going to read the first 4 verses. We'll cut in halfway through verse 1. Acts 8, verse 1. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. There's another type of going. They just were going to go and live in another place, basically to escape persecution. But where they went, wherever they go, it says, verse 4, they preached the gospel. Now, the Bible has various words for preaching. One of them is like I'm doing now, being a herald for Jesus with his authority, speaking to a church. But the word here is not that word. The word here is simply speaking the gospel. Just speaking the gospel. You used to in churches hear the phrase gossiping the gospel. I really dislike that phrase because I just dislike the word gossip. It just sounds horrible, gossiping the gospel. But actually it's quite good. It's quite a good word because it gets across. It's just in normal conversation. It's just over the garden fence. It's just over the coffee machine at work, talking to someone the gospel. What we have here is not standing up front giving a gospel talk. It's just that talking the gospel to whoever crosses your path. These people were urgent. Jesus should be known, and everyone I meet needs him, so let's talk. William Carey was a famous missionary to India, and he was very much a Paul-like missionary, breaking new ground, reaching unreached groups. But how did William Carey become a Christian? Well, William Carey was a shoemaker. And when he was an apprentice, he worked alongside another apprentice, and that apprentice was a Christian. And William Carey despised him because he looked down on real Christianity. But his fellow apprentice just persisted in trying to point William Carey to Jesus. And one day, William Carey did turn to Jesus. You see, we've got a lot to be thankful for to that shoemaker who we don't even know his name, who did the disciple-like going. And then William Carey did the Paul-like going. And every Christian should go in this way, with this attitude. Well, now you know 3 ways of going. Now you know 3 ways the New Testament church did go making, baptizing and teaching. Was that the aim of this message, that you should know 3 ways? Now you could tick it off, you could answer an exam on 3 ways. No, that wasn't the aim of the message. The aim of the message was that all these 3 ways should still be happening because the world still needs them. The aim of the message is that more people go in these 3 ways because more are needed. So we need to pray the Lord's Prayer. Do you know the Lord's Prayer? There's a prayer we call the Lord's Prayer that's really the disciples' prayer. But there was a time Jesus said to his disciples, here's what you must pray. Pray, Lord of the harvest, send out more workers into your harvest field. And we need to pray that because we need more to go in Paul-like ways, Timothy-like ways, and disciple-like ways. So will you pray that prayer? When I was at the end of my teenage years, I was at a prayer meeting, and the person leading the prayer meeting pointed at me and said, now you are going to lead the church in praying for more workers to go into the harvest field. It was all a bit direct like that. And then he got even more direct because he then said, and those who pray such a prayer should be open to whether God is going to call them to go. Well, that was pretty direct. So, will you pray, and will you consider which of these 3 ways you should go?